Okie dokie. Welcome to our most frequent recurring guest, Freetrail editor-in-chief, Trail Society co-host, Corinne Malcolm. Corinne, Merry Christmas. Happy holidays.
Yeah, good to be here. We were both just chatting before we jumped on that. We're both decompressing from very good but very busy holiday weekends in both the Bay Area, Portland, up here in Seattle. Just it's been a whirlwind.
How are you feeling ending 2022? Are you reflecting? Are there any profound takeaways from the past 12 months?
I mean, it's been a big year of change, right? Like I've been married for just over a year. We found out we were moving to Seattle. We moved to Seattle. We bought a house, which we're like still sort of moving into as there are like boxes stacked against the closet behind me. So it feels like I'm finally settling in here, which is kind of a nice way to like round out the year is like, I'm home. I'm making this place my home. And after, having that established in the Bay Area, kind of having to reestablish that back here in Washington has been very good, but a very chaotic, fun last 6 months.
Yeah, well, I can relate, and we're already freestyling here, but for somebody who's been injured for the last couple of years, more or less, I feel like you've just done an amazing job of carving a new, novel, and unique path that is specific to you in these last couple of years. And I hope you feel good as we end 2022 about your greater position in the sport, even though you're not racing or training to the extent I think you want to. So kudos to you, Corinne.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
So we are here to break down the year that was in trail and ultra running. And Corinne and I, this has become a Christmas tradition for us. So just to go through the agenda here before we launch into everything, we're going to go through our trail runners of the year as voted on at fantasy.freetrail.com. This is going to be international. So we're going to give you at least the top half of our ballots, both men and women. We're going to move on to performances of the year for men and women. We're going to talk about some FKT stuff, some rookies of the year, some of the new young talent ascending in the sport. We're going to talk about some of the overall storylines in the sport. We'll hand out the Bill Duper Spirit Award. This is our attempt at recognizing somebody who's made a unique impact outside of race performance. So the Bill Duper Spirit Award will be awarded. We'll make some predictions for next year and maybe expand a little bit more on our personal highlights from 2022 and look ahead towards next year from a personal perspective. Corinne, let's launch into it. Trail runners of the year. Where do you want to start, men or women?
Oh, I mean, can we just start by saying that this was really hard?
It was so hard. So hard.
And that was like the overwhelming takeaway, I think, from a lot of people too, is like, and that even changed because I turned in my Troy, my trail runner of the year. And then I turned in my UROY, like the North American ballot, like a couple days later. And I'll even say like, I'm looking at the screenshot I took and I don't think this is what I submitted. I think I actually made one last change from what I like have on my computer screen right now, because I literally went back and forth. Like I put my top 10 together and I felt pretty good about that, but I literally like was moving people around in that top 10 for forever. I think I resubmitted my picks like 3 or 4 times before the like closing bell. So this was really, really hard. And I think that's the right sensation to come out of this with.
It sure was. And I had the same experience. And we should say here that we're going to be releasing sort of like some of the learnings and some of the statistics from the vote from 2022 and how things will stay the same and evolve in 2023. But it was a really successful first year, the Trail Runner of the Year voting. And I had a similar experience where it was highly entertaining, but very difficult to come up with a ballot. So let's start with the women, Corinne. You get us kicked off.
Okay. So, and again, talking to that, like going back and forth, what are we doing? Are we doing top 5? Are we telling our whole top 10?
Let's go top 5. I think top 10 is maybe excessive. If there's needed to give a few honorable mentions, we can do that.
Okay. And I'm curious to see how we overlapped and how we were different here. And this was very, very difficult. I went back and forth with Ninke and Courtney in my 1 and 2 spots. I don't know how many times. Like, I think that was the thing I kept changing back and forth and back and forth. Also, where I wanted to put Katie Scheid in that list as well, changed a lot based on depth of competition, based on outstanding performances, et cetera. So I ultimately submitted 1, Courtney DeWalter, 2, Ninke Brinkman, 3, Blondine, 4, Ruth Croft, 5, Katie Scheid was my top 5. And like, I had Marianne Hogan in there, and I just like I had to go like head to head competitions as well. Right outside of that group is also Allie Mack and Maud Matthews, who were in my top 10. So it's like having that short distance, like what I found really interesting about the short distance racing, like the sub ultra trail scene, which I think is really engaging and everyone should go watch all those races. But what I found was that if Courtney's where I was going back and forth between Courtney and Ninka, so people can see where my mind was on this, is if Courtney's wins at Madeira, Hard Rock, and Grand Raid had not been course records and historical performances on those courses, I would not have ranked her as high. But it was because they were historically relevant course record performances that kind of bumped it up in my mind, because what Ninke and Allie Mack and Maud Matthews and Danny Moreno and Shayla Alvarez, all these women, what they go through, Remy on the men's side in this head-to-head insane short distance competition week in and week out is also just like so huge. Like competition makes racing harder. And so that to me was the thing that I had to grapple with. Was initially I was like Ninke is number one for me. And then I was like, okay, wait, you're really thrilled with her crazy ability to run both the most insane road marathons and do these things.
Yeah.
And you're like so impressed with the head-to-head competition, but I had to like weigh in there with the number of long distance high performances, which is redundant, that Courtney got in was kind of that small thing that ultimately put her into the number one spot for me.
Yeah. Well, great minds think alike, Corinne, and I'll give you my ballot, but it was almost identical. But just to maybe add to what you were saying, because I went through a similar agonizing comparison in my head. And what tipped me over was the Grand Raid course record from Courtney, where she finished, it was fourth overall and broke the course record by 2.5 hours. And of course, it's not the same as UTMB in that there hasn't been that many of history's best performers going to Reunion Island to compete over that distance. But running that time on that course, in my mind, was a historically great 100-mile performance. And when you combine that with a course record at Hard Rock, an iconic 100-miler in North America, and the early season course record at Madeira, where she was dominant as usual, breaking her own course record there. An amazing season. Plus, I gave her extra kudos for throwing her hat in the ring and finishing 10th at Zagama, going out of her wheelhouse.
Cool. That was super
very cool. But Ninka, to your point, was number 2 for me as well. I think a generational talent is going to be an absolute phenom in the sport if she doesn't get too pressured into just chasing Olympic glory in Paris in 2024. I think Ninka could evolve into one of the truly great, iconic athletes up there with Killian, and just in terms of pure talent and pure capability on the trails. Then I had Blandine in third, the CCC victory combined with world champs just a couple weeks later. And
the Euro 40K, like European championships, which is also a very competitive race.
Right. So Blandine in third for me. And then this is the only place that we diverged. I put Allie Mack in fourth between Broken Arrow, Mount Marathon, the world championship at the vertical, her dynamism at the Golden Trail World Series final. Allie Mack just had an awesome year, and it was so good to see her, sort of come back from a couple of years of injury and come right back up to the top of the sport and take home a world championship and a bronze medal at the Trail and Mountain Running World Championships. And then I had Katie Schott in fifth, of course, UTMB champion, deserves to be on the list. So yeah, great, exhaustive, kind of debrief on the women's field. We could go through our entire top 10, but maybe we'll do that next year. Let's move over to the men, and then we can tick off any honorable mentions after the fact.
Yeah. I guess the hottest take for me that people will probably disagree with is that Jim Walmsley was 9th on my list. But my top 5 were Kilian Jornet, just range, course records, everything. Remy Bonnet in second. I think that he had a phenomenal year. Adam Peterman with that Worlds. I think if Adam hadn't had that Worlds win at the end of the season, he might have ranked a little bit lower for a lot of us. Petter Engdahl in 4th, Jonathan Albin in 5th were my top 5 for Troy.
So again, we had 4 overlaps, but not in the exact order like we had with the women. But I had, of course, Killian. I mean, it's incredible. And we should just say it. I mean, 6 weeks apart, breaking the course record at Hard Rock and UTMB somehow.
And that series and all performance, which was also just out of this world.
Right. And Zagama, he won Zagama in a course record performance in May, taking home his 10th victory there at Zagama already.
That's stupid.
34 years old. Killian is just absolutely incredible and rightly takes home Trail Runner of the Year on both of our ballots. Then I had Adam Peterman in second. I mean, an undefeated season. And
his chuck and up performance, honestly, yes, his Western States performance as a rookie at Western States on the men's side in particular was insanely impressive. But I think the result a lot of people will overlook for him is his run at Chuckanut, which is a storied race, an historic race, a competitive race. Like that to me was like, wow, Adam Peterman.
And of course, won Canyons to punch his ticket to Western States, then wins Western States on debut. And, sort of looking ahead, I think for sure he has the capability to run an hour faster there on that course next year.
Yeah.
And then taking home a world championship, the kid, one of the things that ranks him so high here is not only his performances, but I think he really does kind of represent this new guard of ascendant professionals in the sport. And what I love about him is that he's taking a very intentional approach. He's not like chasing the fame, not chasing the big races, not trying to tick everything off the bucket list in 1 year. He gave himself 3 months without racing after Western States, then came back and won the world championship at 80K in rather dominant fashion by nearly 15 minutes. Then I had Remy. Remy, also a great story from this year. I mean, Golden Trail World Series champion. And I think really coming into his own, he's always been one of the best as a pure uphill VK type athlete, but now really proving that he's an all-arounder, that he can hang on the climbs and the descents and put together multi-day races in rather dominant fashion himself there on Madeira at the Golden Trail World Series final. Then I had Jonathan Albin in 4th on my list and Jim in 5th. And so Petter Engdahl, we have to give an honorable mention to, and for sure when we get to performances of the year, I think we'll both be mentioning Petter, but I put Jonathan Albin in front of him just because I felt like he had a little bit more when you combine his head-to-head victory with Petter at the Maxi Race Marathon. Then he won.
But they were head-to-head at CCC.
Yes, at CCC, they were first and second, and Petter got the best of him there. Jonathan still under course record, second place, but then took home a world's bronze at the end of the season. So I put Jonathan Albin, but we're splitting hairs there.
Yeah, well, Petter was at probably and arguably less competitive than usual Transvolcania, but still ran a really solid win, like a great victory for him to do that at Transvolcania as well.
And both great athletes, and both of whom I think we can look ahead towards next year. And
oh my goodness,
they're very excited about, because I think both of them plan to run UTMB. So
yep, I know that's Petter's goal for next season, which is super exciting. Actually, and to just to shout out teammates. Friends of the pod. Abby Hall, I think, is also going to be stepping up to UTMB next year, which is insanely exciting. And Ruth Croft, it's going to be such a cool race.
Yikes.
Ideally, such a cool race. Fingers crossed on that.
Yeah, and a lot of good honorable mentions there. I mean, Ruth did make my ballot as well. I think she was 6th. Marianne Hogan made my ballot. Abby Hall made my ballot. Yeah. Like I said, Jim was 5th for me on the men's side. Madeira course record, UTMB 4th, and then win Templier. It's funny that can be kind of like a disappointing season for Jim, but I still think.
But when you bring in the like other aspects that make Troy so interesting, like I had Patrick Kipingenio.
Yep.
Kipingenio. I will never say that name right, probably. I had him up in 7th. So I actually had him ahead of Tom and Jim on my list, but mixing up the shorter distance ultra guys into that mix. Like once again, yes, apples and oranges. It's really hard to make those direct comparisons, but sitting down and looking at head-to-head competition, looking at what their season encompassed, was super interesting actually, because there were some results. There was one guy who, he was 8th at UTMB and then won TDG, I think.
Really?
Yeah. Like, I was like, what? I didn't even know that had happened. Like, did not put that together. Which is just baffling for those of you who don't know, right? That was top 10 at UTMB and then doubled back like 2 weeks later, essentially, to win Tour de Gent, which is a 330 kilometer event.
Madness. But
silly. Our sport is silly.
Yeah, so cool. And I guess just to pull the curtain back a little bit on this Trail Runner of the Year award, as before we move on to Performance of the Year, we had considered splitting short distance and long distance and having two classifications. And in hindsight, I'm so happy we didn't, because it really makes this voting system more entertaining and more challenging when you can compare people like Remy Bonnet against people like Killian and Adam Peterman. And on the women's side, comparing Ninka and Courtney. It's like the two of the greatest of all time, but with very different specializations under the greater umbrella of trail running. It's a really fun exercise. So moving on to performances of the year, Corinne, why don't you get us started with, let's start with the men this time.
Yeah. So interestingly, right, too, I like had set this up because we had to think about performances of the year for our UROY ballots. And so initially, like that was kind of where my focus was on this. So for men, actually, like what I put in for UROY was Dakota Jones's Javelina. So just for reference there, but I think my international pick for performance of the year, I was blown away, as we mentioned, Petter Engdahl's CCC. And so that was topped up there. And because it was hard for me to, like, with Killian's performances that were record setting, what was most impressive about his record-setting performances was like the doubling back of other things, that it was like the context made them so insanely impressive outside of just the overall performance. And so that's kind of where I was like, wait, is it the performance that's impressive, like winning UTMB or winning Hard Rock, or is it the context of like what was going on situationally? And so for me, Petter Engdahl's CCC was really just like, wow, this sport is getting crazy. Like the back and forth nature of that race, the course record setting performances, things are just getting faster. Really stood out for me. And then just because we had to vote on North Americans for this on our Euro ballots, from a US standpoint, I was absolutely floored by Dakota Jones's Javelina this year.
Yeah, fantastic. And just to expand on the context of performance, I think it's worth adding, as it pertains to Killian, the specific context of both those races at Hard Rock and at UTMB. One of the coolest things of the year for me was watching Killian and Francois do battle through mile 90 on the Hard Rock course, the race where you typically know who the winner is going to be like 5-6 hours before they arrive back in Silverton to kiss the rock. Killian and Francois going through Cunningham Gulch together at mile 91, just one of those goosebumps inducing historic moments in our sport. And then 6 weeks later, going toe-to-toe with Matthew Blanchard at the UTMB, taking course records at both of those races. And I think importantly, and maybe most significantly, is Killian finally being pushed by some of incredible athletes and still rising to the occasion and still proving that he's the best after all these years.
And not being completely invincible in those moments too. Like really having to struggle and get gritty, I think was really cool to witness as a fan and as a spectator, which also I think maybe this is a storyline theme for this, but it's what you just brought up of this, like the men racing or the women racing to the nitty gritty end of these events is like, that to me speaks volumes about where the sport at the professional end is going. Like it's not always a battle of attrition in a lot of these big races anymore. Like it is head to head. I mean, we saw this in OCC in both the men's race and the women's race. There were podium changes in the final descent from La Flagère, which we like 55K. Sure, that happens. But to see it in the 55K and the 100K and the 100-mile distance that like you're not sure who's going to win until they cross the line is very, very cool. The depth and level of competition is just bonkers.
Yeah. I would agree also that Petter Engdahl, potentially the single best performance of the year. And just in terms of like the stage and the dominance of it and the extent to which he destroyed the existing.
Yeah. First 100K for him too. Like hadn't run that distance before ever.
Yeah. I had him on the pod a couple months ago. Loved chatting with him and really look forward to following the rest of his career. Honorable mentions. I had Adam Peterman at World Champs. I had Walmsley's Madeira, which I think flies under the radar, but he smashed Francois's course record there on a course that doesn't necessarily suit his traditional skill set. So shout out to those guys. Let's talk about the women.
Yeah. So the women's stuff, we mentioned Courtney's Grand Raid as a standout performance this year. And I think that is, there's no situational context to that. Like that was standout to break the course record by that much. While it does not get maybe the attention that other races get, a lot of very good women have shown up over the history of that race to run times there. And to break the course record by that much, to me, really, really stood out. Ruth Croft's Western States stood out as well, given the historical time thrown down there and just the level of competition in that race. We had, we got to watch on live coverage, like Ruth and Emily Hawgood and Keely Henninger come into the Devil's Thumb aid station together. Getting to see that kind of race take a long time to break apart was especially cool. And for her to hold on to the second fastest time ever.
Yeah.
Be just behind Ellie Greenwood, I thought was really, really incredible. And then once again, with my UROI North American hat on, I wanted to highlight Sarah Beal's JFK record, breaking a 10-year Ellie Greenwood record at JFK. So at 2012, Ellie was arguably a very, very fast Ellie. So very cool to see Sarah Beal shatter that time, took a ton of time off of it. And to me, that makes me wonder too, like, I think she's a free agent. I'm really excited to see what's obviously very good at the runnable stuff, but she's kind of, I think she's come out to some like more sky running style races, hasn't done great at those, but really, really curious to see where someone like Sarah Beal and her JFK talent, like, can maybe come into some of these crossover trail races.
Where does she live?
She's a Midwest or East Coast person. She's not a West Coast gal. I want to say she's from the East Coast. I'm probably going to get that wrong.
Yeah. Well, yeah, very cool. And, potentially also fits into that sort of like ascending, maybe rookie of the year category as well.
It's her third or fourth time running JFK. And she's she was second to Sarah Cummings last year. She was not the fastest Sarah on the day. She was second, but I want to say she ran like 20 minutes faster this year to win the race and break Ellie's record. So she's just like slowly chipping away in a fashion that is really, really admirable. And I'm just so excited to see where she goes.
Yeah. Well, I also had Courtney at the Grand Raid, incredible performance. Ruth's Western States, perfectly executed, classic trademark Ruth Croft, just don't screw up, and took home a cougar, a well-deserved cougar, and really wasn't in danger the entire way. She was pretty much in control. And then just some more awesome highlights that I recall spectating and being completely inspired by. Allie Mack at Mount Marathon, incredible, taking Emily Forsberg's course record there. Allie Mack also taking home the World Championship vertical, an incredible performance from her there. And I also had Ninka Brinkman taking the course record at the historic Zagama Marathon, starting the season on the European mountain running circuit. So a lot of incredible performances for both the men and women to keep in our memory banks and the history bank for the year of 2022. Let's any honorable mentions before we move on to FKTs?
I think that covered all the ones that I was really hoping to highlight there, as far as just like really standout performances go. Oh, I guess one that we should mention, he'll get some love when we talk UROI potentially. David Sinclair broke Killian's record at the Rut 50K. David had a good year of like taking down a bunch of Mountain West 50Ks, while also being second to Adam Peterman at Canyons. But his Rut performance, anytime you get a Killian record, I think that should automatically bump you up a notch or two.
I'll be curious to see where he ends up on the UROI list, because he's the type of athlete who flies under the radar. He had
in a big way.
Yeah, incredible season. He doesn't post a lot on Instagram, and he turned down his opportunity to run Western States, and therefore, I guess, kind of, not get exposed to a lot of the media attention inherent in that big stage. But what an incredible season for him. And look forward to seeing what he does in the future, if he does step up or continue to sort of focus on the shorter distance mountain running stuff. But he kind of got everything out of Adam Peterman at Canyons back in April. And it's oftentimes hard to remember those early season performances when we get to the end of the year, but shout out David Sinclair. I wasn't planning to go through UROI. I don't know if there's, sort of specific American people you want to give
maybe some American shout outs. I guess so people that ranked higher for me, or who maybe just missed or were at the back end of my Troy top 10, who made it into my women's top 5, let's say. Abby Hall, who we mentioned, Jasmine Loeffler, Really great season for her. I had her in 4, and then Devin Yanko I had in 5. Just because I think Devin's Umstead overall win, her Javelina win, and a bunch of insanely fast 50-mile races bumped her up for me in a big way. So really cool to see there. The women's top 10 was actually, I think, really, really hard for me. And I think the only person who I didn't mention earlier for my men's group, I had Hayden Hawks in 5th. Arlen Glick in the mix, Drew Holman, Jonathan Rea, who will probably get some more shine next year, got himself a golden ticket back into Western States. I had him in my top 10, as well as Tyler Green and Rich Lockwood. So it was an interesting group, but it was very, the calculus going through the Troy then to Uroy was super interesting, just with the removal of the sub ultra distance trail stuff. And then the removal of some of that kind of just like focusing on the North American based athletes. Yeah.
Well, basically it looks like our UROI ballots are very similar too.
Yeah.
So
that sounds about right.
Through mine. I just pulled my ballot up, but you pretty much covered everything that we needed to say there. So let's talk a little bit about FKTs. It was a quieter year on the FKT front because everybody's so happy to be back to competition, but there was at least a couple noteworthy ones. Do you want to get us started?
Yeah. So you want to do women or men first? Women. Okay. So I had 2 that really stood out to me in the women's side. One is short and one is quite long, and kind of a similar theme for the men's side. So on the women's side of things, I had Andrea Sanson, who lowered the Nolan's 14 record. When you're chasing the likes of Megan Hicks and Sabrina Stanley, it's a pretty big task to take, and lowered it to 45:52. So the first woman to be well under that 2-day mark of 48 hours. Sabrina's second push to get the record back in 2020 was 48:49. So that's a huge chunk of time kind of taken off there. So that to me really stood out as a very stout women's supported fastest known time on Nolan's. And then Kimber Maddox's rim to rim caught my attention, just because like Alicia Vargo, I think unofficially held it before her. I think that she ran it kind of not off the couch. I don't think anything Alicia does is off the couch, but she lowered that by another like 8 or 9 minutes. And it's now, the women's time now stands at like 3:11 or so. So they're about 20 minutes back from the men's time. Rob Craw has the men's time in 2:51. So I thought Kimber's time on rim to rim was super impressive and rounded out her year in a nice way. So
also a great athlete who flies under the radar.
Totally flies under the radar. Yeah. Super, super strong. She had a hard but amazing OCC, kind of charged, was charging, ended up finishing fourth I want to say, just behind ahead Danny. Of Allie. Yeah, I think it was Danny, Allie, or Danny, Kimber, Allie there. So we had so many women in the top 10. That was amazing. But yeah, so I think Kimber flies under the radar. And I thought that performance in particular was very strong and very kind of legitimizing.
Cool. Well, I just wanted to add Courtney DeWalter's collegiate loop. I think this is a loop that when we talked about it on the podcast, she said is completely underrated, especially because it sort of sits in the same neighborhood as Nolan's, but she broke the overall FKT.
And the Colorado Trail too.
Yeah, exactly. But she broke the overall FKT held by Nick Petitella by 6 hours, and the women's FKT held by Annie Hughes by nearly an entire day. So just a casual day and a half out on the trail for the great Courtney DeWalter. Moving on to the men.
That's what she needed.
Moving on to the men, I've also got a short distance and a long distance, so I'm thinking we're probably the same here. I'm guessing you're going Bob Graham round and the incline FKT.
Oh no, actually, I've got an extra long one on my list as well, just because I think the expansiveness of it was like what kind of FKT is built on. So I've got, so why don't you talk about Jack and Remy, and then I'll talk about Travis.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So Remy, I think this one is just worth mentioning because it's like a 15-minute FKT, but
it's so cool.
So stout and so cool. So in Colorado Springs, for those who are unaware, there's a trail called the Incline, and it's very appropriately named because it's basically straight up a mountainside on an old railroad track effectively. And it's just basically a 2,000-foot stairway in less than a mile. So it's nearly impossible to cram more vertical into a single mile than you get on the Manitou Incline. And Remy Bonnet, the Swiss machine, who we've already talked about here in our podcast, came and took the FKT from local legend, one Joe Gray, who's also a generational talent.
A million-time world champion,
yeah.
A million-time US champion, Joe Gray.
Yeah, so came to Joe Gray's home turf and snatched his proud FKT on the Manitou Incline, and then went on to win the Pikes Peak Ascent on the Golden Trail.
Like 3 days later.
And that FKT was really what kicked off Remy's second half of the season, which was just completely insane, and that he's carried over into his ski mountaineering season now. So shout out to Remy on the incline FKT. And then Jack Kunzel, if I'm saying his last name correctly, is an enigma to me and a fascinating character, but broke Kilian Jornet's Bob Graham round record by nearly a half hour. And that is a very legendary loop in the Lake District in the UK. And before Kilian had broken that record, it had stood for 30 or 40 years since a legend named Billy Bland held it for decades. And then Kilian set what everybody thought was a Kilian type unbreakable time. And then an unknown American, Jack Kunzel, comes out this year and takes 30 minutes off of it. And he seems to be a very interesting FKT specialist. So
yeah,
really cool.
I want to see him race. I don't know when. I think he will race eventually. And I think there's some races that really are attractive to him. But if you haven't yet, obviously he needs to come on the Freetrail podcast. But if you haven't yet, his Finn's interview on the Single Track podcast with him, post Bob Graham round, he's actually been on the podcast twice, but the second one, the post Bob Graham round one, was very good.
Sweet. Yeah, I got to get him on the show, and I'll go back and revisit those. But
yeah,
who is your super long distance one?
The super long one was this FKT called the Sierra Peaks section list, and it's 247 peaks in the Sierras, which is in the Sierra Mountain Range, which is pretty amazing.
Wow.
And I don't think it had been done in a calendar year yet. And so Nathan Longhurst, who helped Jason Hardrath on a bunch of the who was so Nathan Longhurst was the youngest ever person to complete the slam, basically up here, the Bulgers. The Bulgers list in the Cascades. Went and started the Sierra project. He did it multi-sport. So he skied the early peaks and was then joined by friend Travis Soares for the second part of it. So they actually did a lot of it together, but Travis is not a snow creature. He hates the snow. And so he skipped a bunch of the early ones when there was snow on them and then came back to them. And so Nathan set this record in 204 in I can't remember what it was, 124 days or something. And then Travis Soares shortly thereafter broke it with 117 days. So not only did they go under a calendar year, they went well under that. They went in the summer, in the climbing season. And so just to that is a PCT, AT, Continental Divide style effort where you're just like going through these peaks day in and day out for months. And so that it was a really cool project. I think it's the type of project that FKT kind of was like the idea it was founded on, of these kind of like these long personal projects, or taking a mountaineer's, like a mountaineer's lifetime project and turning it into a summer project, which is pretty aggressive and very cool.
Yeah, it does certainly have that Buzz Burrell, Peter Bachwin feeling to it, that Sierra section. Shout out to those guys. Incredible. 3-4 months of dedication, just schlepping around in the Sierra. Amazing.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's talk about rookies of the year. This doesn't necessarily need to be people who just got into the sport in 2022, but more so just people who we are identifying as being kind of future talents and who are kind of solidified their position as being really solid performers on the circuit, both domestically or internationally.
Yeah. And I think my slant is always towards a little bit of like, maybe they've had a season of ultra running, or maybe it's their first season, but kind of someone who hasn't been necessarily around for a while. But you could be like a breakout year, I think, is kind of the other way to look at it for some folks. I'm going to start with my women. And there are 3 names that came to top of mind for me. And those were Jasmine Lowther. Obviously, she had run last year, but this year was like an exceptionally amazing breakout year for her, between
Great
Canyons win, being injured and kind of missing out the middle of the season, and then coming back with that CCC near podium finish. She was chasing really hard in the back half of that race. So she stood out to me in a big way. Hannah Allgood, fan of the pod, Freetrail fam member, I think had an exceptionally like kind of breaking into the sports season, being at Gorge. I know she didn't have the day she wanted at CCC, but I thought that her performance at, what was the race with her and Claire and Hillary?
That was San Juan Solstice.
Yeah, San Juan Solstice. Yeah. I thought that was a really standout race for her as well, going up against the two of them and really like it was a battle to the very end between her and Claire. And then her most recent second place finish at in Thailand. So I thought that her season was really, really amazing. And then the last person on my list there was Sophia Lackley, who came on to the Golden Trail Series, seen this year, this, a crossover athlete. She's currently racing on the World Cup for Nordic skiing. Super young, talented human that I hope finds balance, because I think it'd be really tempting to like just run your face off in the summer with this cool new Salomon kind of plus sponsorship on top of your ski sponsorship. Recognizing that she races a full winter into the spring calendar on skis, like making sure she gets enough rest and enough time to train. We'll be very curious to see what that looks like in future seasons, just because obviously a amazing talent, and very curious to see what that looks like in 2026, 2028, et cetera.
Corinne, this is why we're a great team, because I have all the same names on my list, but I'd love to expand a little bit on Sophia quickly, because I think you can add a special element here, given your background as a Nordic skier biathlete. Do you think are Sophia's considerations now with the future of her professional career? Because for me, it seems like she has all the potential to be up there with Ninka Brinkman. She finished second to Ninka in the Golden Trail World Series, and she's only 22. Ninka's 27 or something like that. So it gives Sophia another 5 years to develop as a pure runner. Is she the type of talent who can win the Golden Trail Series or win Zagama or potentially earn a living racing marathons even?
Yeah, I think that she has that talent. But the thing is, I think there are probably a number of skiers who have that talent. And I do think after the next Winter Olympics, we'll see more crossover people. Someone who didn't really have a season on the men's side, David Norris, for example, he just had, unfortunately, a bad string of injuries involving his ankle. He's older. He's closer to my age. But he kind of retired from skiing after this last Winter Olympic cycle. And was really excited to race a lot more this year and just didn't kind of pan out. But I think we're going to see more of that. That's going to be a storyline of, this is getting ahead of ourselves. It's going to be a storyline where we see athletes like Heather Jackson, another maybe a rookie of the year, I would say, who are coming over to trail and ultra while still in, let's say, quote unquote, their prime. It not being a completely secondary move. I'm curious.
But is Sophia going to go to the Olympics and
again?
Yeah,
probably, and can and could. And so
we should emphasize that that's the Olympics in Nordic skiing.
Yeah. So it's like, I think that you can kind of live Olympic cycle to Olympic cycle when you're in those sports.
Yeah.
And so it's likely that she's committed herself through that Olympic cycle. Which would be normal and rational. And she's got a good thing going with the US ski team. She's super young. That team is super young in general. I think Rosie Brennan's the oldest on that team at 33. Jessie Diggins is the next oldest on that team at 31. But then everyone else is 19 to 23 or 24. It's a very young American team. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that still remains the focus through that Olympic cycle, unless she isn't having a good time, doesn't like it, is finding more success running, is maybe there's sponsorship money that influences that. But I think it'll take.
That was one of the things I was wondering about. Could it get to a point where, because I don't know the economics of being a professional Nordic skier, but
it's not great, and it's not much.
That's what I was wondering.
Than trail running.
Yeah, is her deal with Salomon and her ability to earn money. And this is getting to one of my overall stories of the year. I wonder if the economics might persuade her or pressure her to feel like she needs to specialize more as a runner. But maybe she's got so much time ahead of her, being only 22 or 23 years old.
Totally. And you
can go to the Olympics and then still have a 10-year trail running career.
The thing is that the best way to make the Olympic team is to be on the US ski team. Yeah. And there have been athletes in the past who have been very talented at multi-sports, Tad Elliott being one of them. Paige Elliott's brother, for those of you who knew Paige Elliott, Dakota Jones's partner, her older brother, who's a twin. Tad is a very, very talented athlete, has always been a very talented athlete, was on both the US ski team and the US like mountain biking, like pipeline track, like was raced with my husband, Steven, was destined to be a mountain bike Olympian as well as a ski Olympian. And there was a lot of pressure applied to him. Predominantly, it seemed like from the outside looking in anyway, from the ski team to be like, hey, you really like, you got to choose type of thing. And so it's really hard to make those Olympic teams from outside of the pipeline. It's really about being part of that team type of thing. That's definitely your best way in, because you're racing on the World Cup, you're traveling with the team. They've got a really good dynamic going. So jeopardizing that becomes more difficult. So I'm not sure what will happen there. I think as long as she's loving skiing and wants to make that next Olympic team, that will probably be the focus through that Olympic cycle. And then after that point, she could probably do a bit of both, could race some ski marathons in the winter, but focus more on trail running. Like there are options, I think, for her for sure. But that will be, you live Olympic cycle to Olympic cycle. And that's kind of how you make your decisions in those Olympic cycle focused sports.
Good problem to have.
That's a great problem to have.
The Olympics again.
Yeah. What sport do you want to do more? Yeah.
So cool. Well, add that to the list of people who I need to have on the podcast. And yeah, I guess just to tie a bow on it before we move to the men, I also had Jasmine and Hannah. I think by this time next year, Jasmine and Hannah are going to be name brand American long distance trail ultramarathon runners. And I think I know Hannah is at least targeting CCC again, being unsatisfied with her, I think 14th place performance there. But as you mentioned, finishing second at the Thailand 100K just a couple of weeks ago, that gives her an automatic bid into CCC again, where I would expect that to be sort of her bigger international breakout after the Gorge and San Juan Solstice sort of domestic breakouts this season. So let's move on to the men. I expect we have more crossover. Yeah,
you go first on the men. I'm really curious to know what you have to say.
Well, a rookie who I guess fits into that category of it wasn't his first season, but definitely he stepped into a new category, is a person you just did an interview with on freetrail.com, Mr. Rich Lockwood, the People's Champ, which is a great nickname that I'm definitely going to now adopt as I reference Mr. Rich Lockwood, also Seattleite, had an awesome season. He was second at Gorge. He won Tushers. He won Run Rabbit and then finished off with a second place also in Thailand. So Rich Lockwood, I think, sort of like coming into his prime, even though he's an older athlete, he's still relatively inexperienced as a trail runner with tons of runway still in front of him. And I thought he was very much deserving of this Rookie of the Year designation. I also had Eli Hemming, who I found to be an incredibly impressive athlete. And as we've been talking about Sophia Lockley and her crossover from Nordic to trail running, Eli, of course, it was a professional triathlete now coming into trail running. You mentioned Heather Jackson. So we are seeing a theme of great endurance athletes identifying trail running as a fun new chapter of their greater athletic career. And I think Eli very much was the top performing American on sort of the Golden Trail World Series type circuit. He also was second behind Tim Tollefson at Way Too Cool. He and Cam Smith had that awesome battle that you and I commentated at the Broken Arrow Sky Race VK. Just a really solid, consistent high performer against the best athletes in the world. So I put Eli on my list too.
Yeah, I had both those guys on my list. And then the last person I had on my list was Garrett Corcoran. Is that how you say his last name? I'm sorry, Garrett.
I'm not sure. The JFK dude.
The JFK dude. The mutton chops guy. There's a lot of there's a specific look going there, and he's going to run breakneck in the spring. So he's going for a world's team spot, it looks like.
Nice.
But he was second at Mammoth 50K. Didn't have great days at like Canyons Endurance 100K. He was eighth there, was sixth at Speed Goat 50K. He did run Speed Goat last year, but that was really his only ultra and his only trail race on the calendar. So I thought that was kind of, obviously he's got really good flat ground speed. I mean, his JFK was super solid, and it was kind of a battle in which he like grew into the race as the race went on. It seemed like, taking advantage of some other guys having a bad day. I guess one guy we should probably mention who feels like a real wild card at this point too is Chad Hall, who it's like, I have no idea what his deal is or what his plan is or what to expect from him, but he's obviously incredibly talented.
Yeah.
And
he
now
just ran a 62-minute half marathon too.
That's disgusting.
Stupid.
Like these people who are that talented are, just kind of like, I don't know what his plan is, and it's like, I'm curious to follow along and see what happens there. But he beat Eric at the 50K at Mammoth Lakes. He won the Ascent. I want to see him in some more competitive races just to like get an idea. Like I'd love to see him at Broken Arrow.
Yeah.
Right. Where like the field is like a step up, or I'd love to see him.
That would be awesome.
At 50K, or, just something where or Way Too Cool. Like see him really lined up against a field of guys who are going to who are arguably like the best in the country to like just see what the heck happens with him, because he obviously is very talented and we're just kind of getting like a little glimmer of what his deal is.
Yeah. Great pick there. And I was just actually looking at, because somebody sent me his recent post from a 62-minute half marathon, and it said something to the effect of that he was targeting Houston for a fast marathon time, which is, I think, coming up in just a couple of weeks, but that he was a little bit sick. So that he was considering maybe bumping that back to a spring marathon, which would then preclude something like Way Too Cool. But the Broken Arrow idea is a fantastic one, especially after seeing what he did at
he likes
Mammoth
altitude
Lakes.
Clearly, like having him in the mix with Joe Gray and Eli Hemming and Andy Wacker. I'd like to see that.
Awesome. Lots of rookies, lots of young talent, and
young talent, but also like older talent coming into form. Like Rich got into running super late. Yeah, is well into his 30s. Chad Hall's 34. Like you've got this interesting mix of, Jasmine's in her, like Jasmine and Hannah are both like in their late 20s, I want to say. So it's like people just like coming into their own in the sport, in combination then with these like young, out of college or in college cross-country skiing athletes who are, 21, 22. It's super fascinating.
Yeah. So moving on to the overall story of the year, maybe I'll get us started because it's sort of an expansion of something I was just mentioning, is that I feel like now for the first time, Corinne, at least in my experience in the sport, the best young athletes in the world have a viable opportunity to race short distance and make a real career for themselves as they build and mature into their professional career. Because when I was 22 coming into the sport, the Golden Trail World Series didn't exist. The Cirque Series didn't exist. And in the US, at least, the pressure was, if you wanted to make a name for yourself, if you wanted to make a career for yourself in the sport, you had to race ultra marathons and typically even 100-milers. And that's,
well, I was told straight up by Patagonia that they were interested, but only if I started running more hundreds.
So, and of course, that was something that was massively inspiring to me at the time, was to run 100 miles. And I don't regret it whatsoever. But I think that led to a lot of the problems that we saw during my generation of the sport, things like overtraining syndrome, which was usually more like over racing syndrome. We don't need to go into that. But my point is more so that the best young athletes in the sport, people like Sophia, people like Eli, people like Bailey Kowalczyk, now don't need to go run the Leadville 100 or Western States or feel like they need to go straight to UTMB in order to get a professional contract. Now they have the options to build their career slowly, to ease into it, to gain experience, to still travel the world and have these powerful life experiences, and hopefully have really long, successful professional careers as a result. So that's kind of what I put as my overall story, but more my interpretation was more like what was sort of like a newer trend in the sport this year.
Yeah. And I think that the other point of that too is that there's a viable pipeline from domestic circuits into international circuits too, with like what used to be like the domestic skyrunning circuit into the international one, the like domestic based, North American based Golden Trail series now into an international Golden Trail series to get that exposure, have those opportunities. So I think that, like the World Mountain Running Association has been around for forever, but now all of a sudden it's like, cool, you could do a little bit of that, but you could also do the Cirque series and get into Mount Marathon and, run the shorter distance, run the VKs at, things like the Rut and Broken Arrow. So things that I think are getting more coverage as they should. So that's very cool.
Yeah. I wonder if that becomes more lucrative, honestly, because you can race more frequently. Oftentimes the live stream products are more compelling and therefore might be able to be monetized better by people like the Golden
If we
Trail
ever
World.
become like a broadcast sport or a Olympic Games type of sport, it's going to be things like the VK, the up down world champs, the short course looped style format. It's going to be the 26K style stuff. It's got to be under 4 hours, So I think that,
which means the short distance athletes will make a better living. And therefore I think also steal a lot of athletic talent out of other sports, especially road racing, triathlon, Nordic skiing, obstacle course racing. Then trail running becomes a massive international phenomenon, I think.
Yeah. Which speaks to my story of the year. And it is the story of like the viable crossover athletes. I just think, we've always had people who have come from other sports. Trail running has always been the adopter of collegiate soccer players and retired skiers and that kind of thing, or triathletes like that has existed. But I feel like the stage at which it is existing on now, and maybe it's just because the names that are doing the crossing over are a lot bigger, like I came from the US biathlon team to trail running, but like not nearly to the same degree as someone like Sophia Lockley coming from, the last Olympic Games into just phenom on the Golden Trail World Series. Or you've mentioned Eli Hemming, Heather Jackson, like that to me, like Heather Jackson racing Western States in 2023 is like already one of my favorite storylines. Yeah. And there are going to be so many favorite storylines to be had. And so let's
pace ourselves. We've got a lot of time to start prognosticating about
interesting though. And it's like, who knows what will happen in Western States, but like just them wanting to be in this sport, wanting to be part of our community, wanting to be competitive athletes in this world makes me really excited. Yeah. So I think that we're going to see more of that. And then I think after every Olympic cycle moving forward, that will also be a time of transition more so. Like not only are we going to be like, ooh, contracts are up. It's going to be like, oh, all the skiers and biathletes and, speed skaters are retiring at the ripe age of 24. Wonder what they're going to do now. It's going to be, I think we're going to see more road runners coming in that sense before the end of their career, right? Des Linden is going to run some trail and ultra stuff. Cool. But it's like only after she's done all this amazing road marathon stuff. So to me, it's going to be the people who make that crossover a lot sooner. And that is so freaking exciting.
So I got to make a note here for when we record this at the end of 2026 or whenever the next Winter Olympics are, that my prediction for the following year will be that there's going to be an influx of biathlon and Nordic ski talent into the sport. That'll be I'm making that prediction. Put me on the record. Right. That's a great observation.
The 2026 summer will be amazing because it'll be February 2026 when those Olympics happen. So, and in 2025, you can make that prediction.
Okay. Thank you. I'll write that down.
I got you. Don't worry.
Great observation. Great story from the season. So let's move on to the Bill Duper Spirit Award. You want to go first?
Yeah, only because I'm worried you're going to take mine.
Okay. And just to reemphasize again, this is meant to be a recognition of somebody who's really important to the global trail running community, but who in a different way than just being a great athlete, which we spent a lot of time talking about. So this is a recognition of somebody else.
Yeah. So I think and in part it's because we can't give this award to Jamil Curry and Stephanie Case every year. So we have to move on. We have to move forward. So my Bill Duper Spirit Award this year goes to Zoe Rome, the editor-in-chief over at Trail Runner Mag, the managing editor over at Women's Running. a talented runner in her own right, but the work that she does to elevate voices that need to be heard in our sport and to provide a platform for discussions, like actual discussions about the intersectional nature of trail running, be it environmentalism, be it trans and non-binary representation, rights, rules, regulations, etc. I think that that's not an easy position to be in. And it's frankly like a very intimidating position to be in. And she does it very well. And I think that our sport and our world is so much better off for having people like Zoe being willing to take those positions on, because they make hopefully our whole community a whole heck of a lot better. So yeah, my Bill Duper award goes to Zoe this year.
So well deserved. So well deserved. Yes. And Zoe is one of my favorite, one of the people I most admire in the sport, a great leader, a great writer, and somebody who always has the best intentions in mind with everything that she does. So shout out to Zoe. I chose Brendan Madigan, who's a person
Great
that you
choice.
and I both know very well, but who I think, for those who don't know him, I think it's important to kind of recognize what he does, because I think it's unusual and it's worthy of admiration, and it's worthy of trying to follow his example. Brendan Madigan is, of course, the race director of the Broken Arrow Sky Race, but he's much more than that. He's universally respected, fabric of his community, pillar of his community there in the Lake Tahoe area, owns Alpenglow Sports. He has a speaker series. He has various events, including Broken Arrow, and every one of those things, everything that he does has an important give back component. He's a great business leader, but somebody who always, I think, takes that responsibility seriously and prioritizes being of service both to his local community and to kind of the greater community, in this case, trail running. And, the type of person who makes service more important than maximizing revenue. And I think this year 100%. In particular, he was especially worthy of receiving the Bill Duper Spirit Award, with his pushing Broken Arrow forward, making it really one of the best races in North America, and also critically stepping up to the plate and bringing $50,000 of prize money to the professional athletes, while also, through all of his other events, having an amazing give back charitable component to his, big web of businesses and organizations there in the Lake Tahoe area. So Brendan Madigan was my Bill Duper Spirit Award recipient.
Yeah, I think that's a great call. Are you going to his beer bucket run this weekend?
No, I'm not. I should. I tried
Mount Diablo. It's for you.
I tried calling him yesterday on my drive home when we were all texting with him. But yeah, shout out to Brendan Madigan. And I guess I didn't specify this, so maybe it's important to just mention the Bill Duper Spirit Award is named after Bill Duper, who passed a few years ago, but he was a gentleman who lived in Leadville, Colorado, and was known around the Colorado and, North American trail running community as being the biggest fan of the sport, and somebody who everybody had a lot of love for, and who always sort of carried the spirit of trail running with him, even though he was never a participant himself. He was always wearing his trademark Green Bay Packers hat, and, always giving you his hot takes and predictions of the race results before they happened, and always, just a great influence on the sport. And this was our attempt at just kind of recognizing that spirit by giving these awards. So
we should probably make something official. We need to make something official as we give these awards out by talking about humans every year. And we need to, find a way to share that gratitude even bigger.
Make a plaque. And like Corinne mentioned, Jamil Curry and Stephanie Case took home the awards last year, and now Brendan Madigan and Zoe Ryan this year. So get back to it in 2023. So let's start winding down predictions for 2023, and then we'll share some personal highlights and look ahead towards next year. Any big predictions for next year, Corinne?
People are really excited about maybe an expansion of live coverage. I'm super curious to know how that goes, just having worked for wide media this year and all of its ups and downs of trying to do live streaming from all over the world. so curious to see kind of what that looks like in 2023. I do think that we're going to have slightly more than this year, though maybe not as much as people are anticipating. I think that we're going to have some sort of grand finale, but I don't think we 100% know how we're going to get there yet with the UTMB World Series. Like, I think the idea could work, but I think that the series has yet to figure out exactly how it's going to put an elite field together. And so I think I've got a lot of question marks around.
What do you mean by that? Like they're going to add a season finale race, or?
No, I just think that we have yet to have.
Things are going to come to a head, because that's my prediction.
Yeah. Well, so we've got, there is competition amongst series for the athletes. Now we also have a professional union that is forming that will hopefully alleviate some of the discomfort that we all feel with that kind of competition for athletes.
Which you are on the board of, we should mention.
Yeah, yes. I am now a board member. Caitlin Gerben and I represent the U.S. As board members. Seattle represents in a big way. There's 7 of us on the board, and Caitlin Gerben and I are 2 of the members. We're in a bunch of working groups working on a ton of different projects, but one of them is like calendar consolidation and being thoughtful and mindful of travel and championships that conflict with one another or are too close together to actually allow athletes to go both like to Worlds, for example, and the Golden Trail World Series finale. Like that was an unfair kind of back-to-back calendar smush for a lot of people.
You know what's going to be terrible next year is the world champs, when they finally did it right with the Trail and Mountain World Championships, which they did it in Thailand this year, is going to be in Austria next year, but it's in June, which they've like totally screwed up. Yeah. They absolutely should move it back to
but that championships is going to be every 2 years moving forward as well, which I think will be helpful. So my thing is that this is not really a prediction. It's like there's a lot of question marks yet to be answered, I think, more than anything. So much to say that like right now the elites are supposed to qualify by going to UTMB World Series races, so much so that like the top 50 men and women have been reached out to by the UTMB organization to be like, hey, we'll support you to go to 2 other races outside of the finale type of thing. Mm-hmm. But right now, having done commentary for many of the UTMB World Series races in 2022, we actually don't have a super competitive field yet to line up at 2023. And so the organization will have to make a decision as to how they're going to make their elite field elite, because they want it to be the deepest race of the year. And right now it's not setting up to be that way. It's setting up to be smaller and not as deep. So there's going to have to be a back channel way to get elites in. And I don't think the organization knows how they're going to do that yet.
It's amazing how on the same wavelength we are, Corinne, because this is my prediction for 2023 is that UTMB is going to have to reevaluate their model. It's too confusing. It's too exclusive. They're having a really hard time acquiring races in the US. They're alienating.
People can't travel to things. Like it's, if you like, based on where you live, like you can't actually make it to any of these races. And it's like, it's economically disadvantaged, like people are economically at a disadvantage. It's just, it's increasing barrier. It's adding barriers of entry to this event and the events that surround it. So I think it's going to be 2023 might be a weird year for the organization. And I'm not sure what that is going to look like, which is speculation and not actual prediction.
Well, I guess the prediction is that something's going to have to change, and it'll be interesting to see how they arrive at whatever evolution they need to come to. But I think it's a fair prediction that something is going to have to change, and they're self-aware enough to understand that. Say a little bit more about the Pro Trail Runners Association. I'm actually having Francesco Puppy on the podcast, and we're going to talk about it at greater length.
Great.
Yes, he is great, a great athlete, and also has the best intentions for the sport and for the professional athletes. And I think since you're a board member, this would be a great opportunity for you to just do a quick intro.
Yeah. So we had our first General Assembly meeting. The plan is to probably have an annual General Assembly where things are voted on for the next year, including every 2 years, there'll be board members can be voted on. And then we'll also are voting on projects. It's set up. So Killian, Francesco, a number of guys kind of were at the helm.
Pascal Agli, the Swiss runner.
Yep. Sky running athlete. They tried to get this off the ground a couple of years ago. It didn't really happen. They kind of went back to the drawing board and got things off the ground again this year, which is really important. We had our first General Assembly meeting that I think we had like 130 athletes on the call, which is pretty cool. It's also pretty wild to get like a Zoom or Google Meet invite from Killian. You're like, oh, okay, this is totally normal.
I want to say more about that in a sec, but keep going.
But I was told about it via my teammates, Petter Engdahl, who's close with Killian and Jonathan Albin. But the idea being that, that the athletes should have a voice in this. And, people are like, well, how do you get these corporations and races to listen to the athletes? And, in our first General Assembly meeting, Killian said, well, we're not planning to strike, but now we can if we need to.
Yeah.
Like, because
collective bargaining.
Yeah, you have to have a group entity, kind of not hive mind or hive thinking, but you need to have a way to communicate effectively amongst the professional athletes in the field and then
speak with a unified voice. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, we'll have a general secretary who is kind of part of that public facing person. They're also going to be, that is a paid part-time position with someone who's no longer in the sport, but will kind of be the interacting face amongst entities. But the current, we just voted on projects. They range from anti-doping to contract literacy. I'm calling it contract literacy because part of that is understanding what's in your contract and knowing what should be in your contract. And also making sure there's like fair bargaining in that, to environmental policies. Part of that is the travel to some of these races. Kind of like athletes' rights focused, which mostly has to do with like how we interact with race organizations, including like press, pre-race, during race, and post-race, making sure that's that there is, equality across gender representation in that as well. That's been a big issue in the past as far as like pre-race, during race, and post-race media coverage for both the men's field and the women's field. So there's a lot of sub projects that are going to be getting off the ground in the next couple months with working groups that are made up of other professional athletes. That'll be kind of like, we'll have board members at the helm of those things with working groups kind of in collaboration to get those projects moving along. But exciting to like have an actual policy and thought process around anti-doping and anti-doping education. Like pretty excited to have a policy and a thought process around like contract literacy and what's in your contract. So I think it gives us the workaround we need.
Yeah. And just organizing the pro athletes to understand what the challenges are and how can we confront those challenges so that people can create a great living for themselves and be healthy at the same time and do what's right for the greater community and for the environment, for the world.
Yeah. And what we don't have yet is there'll probably be additional working groups that are more like country themed, i.e. like, it's not so much to be a working group, but to have like a general assembly amongst the North American athletes and have an assembly amongst athletes that are in Western Europe or like in the Schengen region type of thing. So that the specific needs of the Asian athletes, of the Western European athletes, of the North American athletes, of the South American athletes, like having voices, because otherwise they get drowned out by the loudest voices in the room.
Yeah.
So to be able to have all of those things heard, I think is going to be really important. And we haven't 100% gotten to that next phase of the project, but that I think will be an important thing to move forward within that kind of within the working groups, having some like kind of country or nationality themed meetings will be important.
Cool. Well, thanks for the quick intro on that. And again, we'll have Francesco on the podcast to talk about it in more detail. And the one thing that I wanted to add on it is just how awesome it is that Killian is the one or part of the group who got this off the ground, right? The greatest of all time. If there's anything he doesn't need to do, it's to look out for his fellow colleagues in the professional ranks. I mean, he is, I'm sure, the best compensated professional in the history of trail running for sure. And the type of person.
But we need that. We need
exactly.
We need Courtney and Jim to also be part of that, like, group of like, if we are all going to make a stink about this, like they have to be making a stink with us. They can't be like, we're going to be over here not doing anything to harm our personal relationships with these race organizations, like to make change. I think that's why I'm on the board, actually, is because I was like, look, I've been the squeaky wheel without fear of being blacklisted yet. Like I can do a lot within this organization with the backing of the rest of the board and the rest of the professional athletes in mind.
Leadership. congratulations to you for being elected, Corinne. And yeah, just so cool that Killian and the rest of the team have taken on this project, and look forward to observing, cheering from the sideline, and participating where I can. So moving on, let's wrap up with some personal highlights from 2022. I think we probably overlap significantly on this even too, Corinne. So maybe I'll go first. Number one, I'm a dad now, which is the most incredible thing ever.
I am not a dad now.
Yeah, that's one thing we don't overlap on. But yeah, of course, that was just massive personal highlight of my entire life. It's brought a lot of new fun challenges into our lives, but it's just been an absolute joy. So big shout out to my new son Rhodes, and of course my wonderful wife Harmony. We also moved back to Marin. We bought a house in Marin, which is a lifelong dream, or certainly a decade-long dream of ours. So achieve that. But like you, not much racing or competition or even a lot of training. It's been a year of more building family, building business, and that's brought a lot of joy with it too. And it's certainly a different year than I'm used to, without a lot of focus on my own competitive athletic goals, but focusing on other goals, which has actually been a fun change of pace. But looking ahead towards next year, I'm very much excited to hopefully get disciplined again as an athlete. And I'm number 6 on the Hard Rock men's finishers wait list. So I'm operating as if I'm in the field there at Hard Rock. And that gives me a lot of motivation to get my butt in gear as we start 2023. What about you?
Yeah, I was gonna say, it turns out that Dylan and I are just not allowed to live in the Bay Area at the same time. Because when I moved there in 2018, you moved away like a week later. And then now I've left and you've moved back. So yeah, Dylan and Corinne just aren't allowed to live in the same place at the same time. It's really fun. It's really good for our working relationship.
Thank God for Zoom.
Thank God for Zoom. Yeah, no coffee meetings, it turns out. But I think the big things that we mentioned earlier, like we moved to Washington State, kind of back in our former community. We lived in Bellingham before. So now I get to like chase Caitlin Gerbin and let our dogs chase each other around the trail, which is a delight. Kind of some big changes on the work front. I now run a solo coaching business, which is kind of wild. I'm the editor-in-chief at Freetrail, which is also wild.
Go.
So jobs I've kind of bullied my way into.
Well earned. I mean, like I said at the top of the show, Corinne, you've really I'm sure you hear this from a lot of people in the community, but it's been awesome to see you. I mean, like I just said, leadership, is the first word that comes to mind with everything that you do, and you wear that responsibility well.
Thanks. I feel like I'm not very good at taking compliments, so I'll just let that one roll off my shoulders and I'll absorb it later. But yeah, I got to race this year and then got to not race again this year. So I'm excited to hopefully repeat that next year, in which I get to race again. So I'm running right now, which feels good. I'm not running a whole lot. I'm running like 30 miles a week. But it's baby steps back into the world of trail running, and I'm not in a rush, but I feel so fortunate that I have been able to be part of the trail community in different ways in 2021 and 2022. While not maybe getting to flex those competitive desires quite as much, but getting to be at so many races, getting to physically and then also on live broadcast cheer on friends and teammates and people from our community has been a real treat, and hopefully get to kind of help shape the live broadcast stuff moving forward. But yeah, it's been a big year of change, a big year of growth, a big year without too many races on the calendar. But 2023, hopefully you and I are both back on some cool start lines, both here in the US and also abroad.
That's my prediction for 2023, is that Corinne and Dylan reemerge into the racing circuit. So write it down and we'll check and see if we were right when we record this episode next year. Corinne, it's an honor and a privilege to share the podcast with you again. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds good.